Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is the Private Investigator Experience. Our host is Phil Little, and I'm Wade Little. Today, we're going to be talking about threat management and the world of a bodyguard. Now, some may think that being a bodyguard is the same as working in the threat management protective world. Well, it's really not. And we're going to look at that and talk about that. We're also going to look at the world of forensics and how that interplays in the threat management area and when it started. Well, let's get into it first by saying hello to our host, Phil Little. Dad, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Wade, and good evening, good day to everyone, whatever time it might be. Thank you for joining us. I was thinking about this as I thought about the protective area threat management coming into birth in around 1990. And I think you've probably heard me say at staff meetings, action planning meetings for cases, okay, guys, let's think about everything that could happen, figure out every possible scenario, and then we'll have invariably something would happen that we hadn't thought about, no matter how well we thought we'd covered everything. And I was thinking about this with the forensic area and the threat management unit. In the early 80s, I had gone to Europe with a group of law enforcement officials on a trip to study how European countries had dealt with the possible terrorist threat at an Olympics. And we went to Scotland Yard and French National Police, GSG 9 in Germany, and Italy police and intelligence agencies. And on that trip with me was a world-renowned hostage negotiator and forensic psychiatrist. And he really spent a lot of time with me telling me how important that was, particularly for the Olympics coming up.
I remember that time frame and the different things that was going on around that whole field. And so seeing at that time, the forensic world in the investigative field hadn't really taken off at all. It was probably not even walking. It was maybe crawling, as they would describe a baby. You got to take steps. First you crawl, then you take steps. But so in those days, the investigative world, you went out, you knocked on doors, you walked the streets, pounding shoe leather, as they say. So at that point, how easy was it for you to adjust to doing this or taking this scientific approach to what your years of experience told you was, hey, I need to get out on the street, I need to knock on doors, I need to talk to people?
Well, it was having a great mentor. Dr. Bruce Stano and his wife, Joan, were both forensic psychiatrists. He was a retired colonel in the military, had been a hostage negotiator, and he was attached to a sheriff's department as a reserve there in Detroit, where he was doing hostage negotiation and forensic work. And he started talking to me on this trip over this 3 weeks, constantly talking about how important it was, and even to us as private investigators and a global security firm, and knowing who we hired. He said there was so much more that we could know. And I said, oh, tell me. And he began to tell me how we could develop testing profiles that we could determine what kind of work an agent that we hired could really do. We found that not everybody could work around celebrities. Some were great at surveillance. They were great at interviewing. But when they got around a celebrity, they become silly kids. And that didn't work. And we found that we had those that were unbelievably excellent, professional. So with this forensic approach, we were able to weed out and determine who could work where before we had a problem with a client. And as I thought about this later, that was in the early 80s, 10 years before the problem came about with the celebrity protective area management. And I wondered, why didn't I think about using on our threat cases when we had threats on a client, such as letters or whatever? Nothing was ever done with those. They were sometimes the studios or clients would throw them away. And I just said, why didn't somebody think about it? But we didn't. And it took a serious problem of Rebecca Schaefer losing her life in 1989 that woke everybody up, that this area of bodyguards and personal protection around celebrities had to change.
So let me ask you this question then. How did this new knowledge, this new information change your approach when a client would call you and say, I need bodyguards. for my event, for my family, or whatever. And back then, and even some today, when you think of a bodyguard, you think of a big hulking individual who's intimidating looking, who never smiles, and who the fear into people. So would you say, I'm sorry, well, you need to wait a little bit? Let me go talk to my forensic team before I can give you some input? Or did you at that point start blending by providing the bodyguards to the threat protective unit with forensics?
Well, that's a good question because clients would call, and I remember so many times they would say, I want the biggest guys you've got because we need them out here now. And I would say, okay, we can handle your problem. I understood that this problem was very serious to them and they wanted action. I would start asking them questions. I had a checklist. I worked hundreds of these, but I always use a checklist so I wouldn't forget something. And it would be, what kind of threat did you get? Was it written or verbal? Was it on the phone? How many of them have you gotten? How long have you been getting them? Have you preserved the letters of the threats that came in or documentation on phone calls? And so many times we'd found that they didn't even have some of the threats, but others would just throw in a drawer or something. Numerous people would have handled them. So as I'm talking to them, I'm getting their name, their address, and I would say, I want you to take these letters that you have, don't touch them with your hands, even though they've been touched by a lot of people already. Use a tissue or gloves, put them in a plastic bag, seal them. I have an agent on the way to your location to pick that envelope up and he'll get them back here. And within an hour or two after receiving them back here, we will have a forensic evaluation. And at the same time, I'm dispatching two agents to your location, protective agents, and they will get there. I will be on my way there or one of my assistants. And normally on these, I would go myself for the first visit. And so simultaneously, we did not let the client hang in a void where they could become fearful or think that we're not going to do anything for them. But we responded at the same time. We wanted to make sure that we could determine. Now, sometimes the sender of those letters would get sloppy and we would get some fingerprints off of them that led us to the person. But other times we wouldn't. But out of every one, doctor would take those letters and he could start building a profile on the person. And time after time, when we caught the person, that profile that he wrote up front, just from those written communications, was 100% right on. So it proved to be very important. So I got that agent as soon as he could back to the office so that Dr. Dano could go to work.
Well, you touched on this, and this was before the term like mental health issues or things along that line, which we hear a lot today when something happens. Back then, there were more descriptive words that were used when somebody would send out threatening letters or cut up dolls or whatever it may be. But when you look at these packages or letters, knowing that they have been manhandled by not only the person who sent them initially, but by people in mailrooms, family members, business colleagues. What did you hope to find on these packages or letters?
Well, we were looking for the needle in the haystack on that. First off, we wanted the dialogue. That was important for Dr. Dano. But then we went through these with forensic first fingerprinting, and we would many times get fingerprints from underneath the seal of the envelope. And sometimes we had 4 or 5 good sets of prints on the envelopes from people around the business. Well, we would take those people's prints and eliminate them. And if we had a set of prints left that wasn't the person there, it was a good chance that it was that person. Of course, it could have been in the mail process. But those always prove to be something of value, whether it was a postmark, where it came from, the time. There were so many things that we could learn from that. And most of the time, the security, the reason for being careful with this kind of correspondence wasn't there. So I would brief them immediately on how to deal with any other threats that might come in. We would take charge of those before anybody touched them. And then we would also give a copy to the LAPD Threat Management Unit, which was formed in 1990 around that by Lieutenant John Lane was the first commander of that, which we were involved in the uh, uh, setting up of that and developing the threat management that ultimately went worldwide. And in reality, when it was over, I don't remember a time in all the cases we worked that we did not find the suspect that sent the threatening letters. So it was tradecraft that we used and that we would help draw these people out once we determined who they were.
And this was a time frame before DNA was could really be used, especially by somebody in the public sector. So, DNA to see if somebody licked the stamp, licked the envelope closed, or now in today's world, that's a very prevalent tool that can be used. So the process to put together the protective detail would go forward along or working hand in hand with the forensic evaluation, which would determine how to be proactive with the protective detail. How does that work together?
Well, we always erred on the side of caution. So that's why I would send at least two protective agents for the initial setup. Now, when we would get the initial threat assessment from Dr. Dano, we would start to determine what do we need to do. Usually we had a scale of 1 to 5, and one was just a letter that was harmless. There's no appearance it was going to go anything further. That was where it would start. Up to the level 5 would be when we had a high threat of violence. So we had to go into action. So once I determined that initial threat, let's say he said it was 1. He said, Phil, this is not any issues here I see. We just need to monitor this. If more come in, tell them to be cautious. So I would reduce the security, maybe only have one person there to help reduce their costs as we evaluated that. Then if letters kept coming, which they usually would, then we would increase the threat level as needed and then provide a more robust protection agent detail. But at the end of the day, we never did anything that we felt was going to put the client in harm's way or to be injured.
And obviously that's our number one goal, is making sure the client is safe and taken care of. So when it comes to protective agents, and you talked about how a forensic, I guess in lack of a better word, or maybe it's the correct word, examination takes place. And when somebody would come in and to be an employee as West Coast Detectives and they wanted to be a protective agent, they would have to do a lot of paperwork, right?
Yes, a lot of testing, a lot of setup on the interview.
Right. And so then Dr. Danto would take that paperwork, the documents they filled out, the questions. I forget the term or what it's called when somebody, like a psych evaluation questionnaire that they do.
Right.
And that is any serious job that somebody applies to. A lot of times there's a psych eval that they have to do. So we've heard the term cowboy used in the protective world. When the term cowboy is used, what's that referring to? And did you ever have cowboys that worked for you?
Well, we tried to eliminate the cowboys, even though I'm a great cowboy guy. I love horses, but these kind of cowboys were the ones that were looking for a fight, that were a little bit too aggressive and were going to barge their way through because they had a gun, perhaps, and they were looking for trouble. And that we didn't want that. We wanted to avoid that. So part of this testing helped us eliminate those kind of people. But once in a while, one would slip through. But fortunately, we had things in place to catch them quickly and to eliminate them. But most of the time, some of the tests that Dr. Daniel did were 250 questions. And it was amazing how they could do these that would catch the people, even though they didn't realize that they were giving away sometimes those little secrets that they didn't want any of us to know. Then also, we dealt a lot with training. We did a lot of role playing, a lot of training. And we taught our agents to first find a way around the problem. I don't care how big a gun they had, how good they were at martial arts, but if they saw a problem up front of them, find a way to take their client around them. Don't go trying to barge through it. So we headed off a lot of potential problems and avoided violent confrontations that might have exposed not only our agent, but the client. So if we do make a mistake, we try to make them very small and don't make them twice.
So if we look back over the past 30 years, approximately, of the founding of the threat management unit, that was the first one was out of Los Angeles, as you mentioned before, that West Coast, that you were part of the original founding. So it's been 30 years since that. And obviously, I think probably any large size, medium size law enforcement agency has a threat management unit now. What has been the result of the threat management units now, as they are basically all over the world? And have there been any negatives in that area?
Realize everything is human, and there might have been some negative somewhat, but I haven't ever heard of any. It's all been positive. What this did, it gave an awareness to law enforcement. I remember when I was a young deputy sheriff, and we went on in the 60s. I'm dating myself here. And we would go on a domestic violent call. We didn't have any of these tools to work with that we have today, or we even had after the threat management. And it was just going in blind. So what we wanted to do here was make awareness the first thing. So law enforcement became aware of how serious this was. Laws got passed that would help give the law enforcement tools to arrest people who were making threats, terrorist type threats or violent threats, in order to take people out of a domestic situation prior to waiting for something really violent to happen. So this was a major positive all over the world. It became a serious situation when someone received a threat. It wasn't just looked at like in the old days. Well, nothing's happened. There's been no violence yet, so we can't do anything. So that's all been changed now. So that's been the big positive. Probably many, many lives has been saved from the threat management professionalism that was brought into law enforcement all over the world.
It used to be basically, call us when something happens, call us when somebody gets hurt, call us when something happens to somebody, where now it's what we always instilled at West Coast is prevention. I guess thanks is the big term here, because if you've been a private investigator for any period of time, and especially if you worked at West Coast Detectives for any amount of time, it's drilled into you about prevention, about thinking things through, like we talked about earlier. What could happen, and let's plan for it now. And so many people, when they come into this field, especially back then, they had no grasp of that concept. So it's been good that we've seen that, I think, a lot. It is interesting to me. So, all right. So as we start to wind up now this episode, and as we've talked about the forensic aspect and of the threat management units, and we've talked about the positive aspects of the growth in that whole field, maybe we should do a show on forensics and have a doctor in who can explain a lot of that, because that's amazing on how that works. But as we find ourselves, whenever a threat is issued, I guess the thing that we need to make sure is that you have a professional who's in the threat management field. And that means when we respond, we make sure that we have someone who has been trained and has the background. What kind of training or background does somebody need if they want to have some skill and knowledge in this area?
Well, so many of the people that came to work for West Coast Detectives came out of law enforcement, military, or other training. And there's also some very good private schools now that have specialized training in the threat management and protective services. I think part of it is too, I remember some of the best people we had at West Coast Detectives were young people. Sometimes they were only 20 years old, 19 or 20, so they couldn't go into law enforcement until they were 21. But these young people were just amazing. And they had common sense. They were mature. And so they we're able to be great in our fields. I think that's the first thing. Have a passion, be mature, have good common sense, and then we can have a great team of people. So maybe we want to wrap this up, Wade, and let people know how they can help us.
Sure, I'd love to do that. Thank you for watching the Private Investigator Experience. If you haven't already done so, please hit that subscribe and like button. Tell your friends and family, anybody else about this show. We really appreciate that. We have an email address. If you would like to send us a question or any thoughts that you might have, you can send that to us at plipi777@gmail.com. And again, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Dad, any last thoughts?
Yes. Thank you all for your help and your support. We appreciate it. And also, you can leave comments either on a podcast or on YouTube. Also, and we'll respond to those. So until next time, may God bless you. May God keep you and your family safe. And may God bless America.